Hello, everybody. Sorry, I'm running a little bit late today. Had one of my appointments run a little bit over, but I hope all of you are doing well, staying safe. Winds are still pretty crazy right now, and it's raining quite a bit over here in the Bay Area. So, wherever you guys are at, I hope all of you, if you're commuting, hopefully you're just listening and not watching. But if you're watching this after the fact, I hope you got home safe. And I know some people said that they were sorry that they couldn't make it last week, but I'm just happy that everybody made it home safe. And hopefully, there's going to be some good information here, regardless whether you catch it live or not. And there's always going to be next time. So let's see here. We'll go ahead and get started with today's topic, and that will be the best suspension for the money. And what we'll do is we'll work up in different price ranges, and the first one might actually surprise you, and that is actually what we hope to accomplish once we have all of our suspension mods in place. But the first category that we have over here is going to be the $500 price point. And as I said before, this one might surprise you because here I would say, as far as suspension components are concerned, save the $500. So the best mod for $500 is saving it. And this is going to be really important once we move up in scale, that you saved this $500. And so if you have $500, I would say that's great pocket money to have in case something like you spring a leak in the oil filter housing gasket, valve cover gasket, if your oil pan starts to leak. This is a good portion of money to put aside for emergencies. So $500, I wouldn't say save up $500 and buy suspension components. I would say just save $500. And once you hit these other landmarks, you're going to really wish that you had this $500. So the next one is going to be springs at the $1,000 mark. And most people, when they get to $1,000, will start thinking about springs. However, I would say no. When you're at that $1,000 price point, springs are going to be good aesthetically. And maybe if you decide to do something like car shows, if you're doing a lot of photo shoots, something like that, then I suppose springs would be a good option. However, I feel like it's a waste of money. It's a waste of $1,000 because for $1,000, what I would actually recommend over this are the lower control arms and thrust arms from SPL Parts. The lower control arms, I think, is like $800 and then tax, while the thrust arms are $700. I think it's a difference of $100 cheaper for the thrust arms. And I know that a lot of people are saying, well, if you buy both of them, it's more than the $1,000. And this is where the $500 saved comes in. If you have that $500 saves, you can put that towards this. And while you're doing one, you're kind of already there anyways. So you might as well just do both at the same time, unless for testing purposes, you would prefer to do one and then the other. So this could be $1,000 or even less. So you could say $700, $800. This is the price point that I would put you at first. And what I noticed with a lot of BMWs that have the electronic steering rack is that they have quite a bit of bump steer. So if you're not familiar, bump steer is, say for example, you hit like a pothole or like a bump in the road really quick, and the steering wheel will jerk to one side or the other really quick. Oftentimes it's just moving within the dead space. So the steering wheel might jerk, say, a fraction of a turn to the left or right, and nothing really happens to the car because it's just taking up the dead space before the wheels actually move. These will actually get rid of that bump steer. So it will make the steering rack more responsive, but it will also prevent that bump steer from happening if you hit a pothole, a dip, or a speed bump. This is what I would say you should spend your money on when you're at $1,000. And if you saved the $500 from what we recommended earlier, you can get both. Moving on up in $500 increments is $1,500. And here you could go to something like the STs. However, if you live in an area where they put salt on the road, this might not be the best thing because of I think it's like a zinc alloy body. And they only, I believe, come with a 5-year warranty. So if you plan to keep your car for a while, this might not be the best option. However, because they are partnered with KW, they have, the tailored dampening with the springs all packaged in. If you're talking about like just the performance, like getting the coilover to work, fit, be comfortable, all of the things that you experience in the car, this will deliver very similar to a KW because it's a sister company. However, it's when it's time for the upkeep that you'll notice a difference. And considering the price difference between something like this and the KWs, I feel like you definitely get your money's worth when you upgrade to something like a KW V1 over this because they are very similar in price. So I would not recommend this if you live in a climate that I mentioned earlier, or if you plan to keep your car beyond the warranty. KWs, very much like BBS wheels, tend to keep their value. So if you're selling a car and somebody sees that they have KWs, they know that it has a lifetime warranty, and you could do something to. So if you're selling the car and somebody says, "Oh, could you come down? The suspension, you've had it for a while, this and that." If you're doing a private sale, you could always tell them, "Hey, if these KWs go bad, they do have a lifetime warranty. I will claim the warranty on your behalf. You just have to cover the shipping and all the things price related to claiming the warranty." STs, you're not going to be able to do that. So if somebody tries to nickel and dime you, you can always say, "Hey, if you want a brand new suspension, something happens to those KWs, I'll claim the warranty for you." And if you did save that $500 that we mentioned earlier, you're not really at $1,500. You're really at $2,000. And here's where you can make that leap to the V1s, which aren't exactly $2,000. They're a little bit less than that, depending on, your state's tax. And here I would say this is definitely worth the money. I've done the DDCs because I have the EDC on mine. But if you wanted to just do a simple a bolt on and you code out the EDC, this is the way to go. If you don't plan to track your car, this is going to be a huge upgrade over what you currently have. And if you don't want to go through the hassle of adjusting everything, then this is the way to go. And I also think that, although I like KW, if you're somebody who just wants a perfect direct fit and finish, Bilstein is the way to go. I just can't recommend them because I haven't tried them out. The other thing is that, or the reason why I say that is because of the end link placement here. And I think Harvey has touched on that a little bit in the comment section, where the end link, depending on if you have a stock sway bar or an aftermarket one, and it varies between the brands, you're going to have to get a different length end link. So if you go somewhere like SPL Parts, even though they say that this adjustable end link will fit the F30, F22, depending on the sway bar that you have and the suspension that you have, that might not be exactly true. I just reached out to SPL Parts earlier this week and I asked them, "Hey, I'm probably going to throw on some V3s on the F30. It has a stock sway bar. Do you know if the SPL end link will work?" And they told me that they don't have something like that on the record. So I'm going to have to actually measure that and then potentially special order that end link. So just keep that in mind. With the Bilsteins, you're pretty much going to be able to use your OEM end links if you're using the OEM sway bar. And then jumping up to $3,000 if you're somebody who plans to track your car and go really hard on it, then I would recommend something like the V3s or the Club Sports. I do believe that the Club Sports, although they are more expensive than $3,000, the adjustment point's location is more convenient on the Club Sports than it is on the V3s. The V3s, it's very close to the bottom, so in order to adjust it, you'll have to go underneath versus being able to adjust it from the top of the strut mounts in the front. And I do understand that in the F chassis, the strut no longer goes through the chassis anymore. So being on the bottom, it's reasonable considering the car's layout. But I really wish that the adjustment points for the fronts were at the top versus the bottom, because that means every time you want to make an adjustment, you're going to have to lift up the car. And this can be really tiresome in the very beginning. So if you're somebody who just installed your coilovers and you're trying to play with the settings, you're already pretty much tired from the installation, and then you have to jack up the car and then bring it back down, test the adjustment, bring it back up, go back down. So it can be a little bit tiresome, but usually once you figure out what it is, you either have like 1 to 2 settings that you'll want, one for the street and then one for the track. But if you do have $3,000 saved up and you don't track your car, then I would recommend to pair with your Bilsteins or KWs that you have that extra money, whether it be from the $500 that we saved, or if you have $3,000 saved up plus the $500, you're going to have more than enough cushion to do something like camber plates as well as your end links. And this is really important for people who plan to fit something like wider wheels on their car. It's better to adjust the camber from the top, because you have, if you just look at the physics behind it, although I did it backwards, and I'm going to see how it is the other way around. So what I initially did was, because I hated the bump steer so much, is that I did the lower control arm and thrust arm from SPL first, dialed in the camber with that, and then fit in an 18 by 8.5 all around with 245/35 tires. If you just look at the dimension of the lower control arm and thrust arm versus an entire strut connected to a camber plate, the camber plate is better designed to withstand the angle that's accompanied with the additional camber. And also too is it's leveraging it from a higher point in the car. So imagine if, kind of like if you're, the only thing I can think of right now is like if you're cooking, right? And you're doing like a mixing bowl, you would mix it by holding the spoon at the top, because that's where you have the most leverage to turn. It's the easiest amount of effort. You don't hold the spoon close to the bottom of the base of the bowl and then stir there. You have very little leverage and you're going to get tired out sooner. So if you are planning to fit in wider wheels and dial in that camber, it's better that you rely on the strength of your camber plates and the struts, which are thicker in general and have more surface area to distribute the load, and they're doing it at a stronger point in the system versus the lower control arm is trying to dial in that camber while also supporting the knuckle, the wheel, the strut, and the camber plate, because it's at the very bottom of that entire system. However, if you have both, you can distribute the load a little bit more proportionately. So I wouldn't say 50-50, because again, you have more strength at the camber plate as well as at the strut versus the lower control arm. So if you want to do like a 80-20 split in order to dial in your camber, at least you have that. The other thing too is that you're able to adjust, I would say, do whatever you can with the camber plate. And then say, for example, when you're at full lock left to right, if you have some rubbing, whether it be on the strut or the fender liner on either side, use the lower control arm and thrust arm to push the wheel out or in order to prevent that rubbing. That's how I would recommend, and even the shop recommended to me, that you do the camber adjustment. Do 90% on the camber plate and then fine tune it with the adjustable arms. And then if you do something like KW, expect to invest about $250 for your end links. If you do Bilstein, then you can use the OEM ones if you have an OEM sway bar. As a side note here, I'm not necessarily sponsored by SPL. I just have a good email communication with them, and they've been very flexible as far as like helping me test fit end links. But to be honest, I do not like all of the end link options out there. I hate the system that it has. It has the the adjustment point, and then it has a jam nut there. I really wish it was more like the rear arms that have the locking collar. That way, when you tighten it down, it doesn't make a slight adjustment. When you're working with this type of end link with a jam nut, that last final oomph that you give it to lock it into place can jar the end link just a touch. And because you have to do it on both ends, if it jars it in the same direction, it's completely off. So you have to really pay attention when you're doing your end links. And if you have over $3,000, I would recommend a rear diff. Now, some of you are probably going to look online and see that something like the M Performance diff is less than $3,000. However, if you're planning to do a diff, I would recommend the WaveTrack, because the OEM one, and even I think it's Quaife, they use like a friction plate that holds it into place in order to prevent one wheel from spinning free while the other one is static. So it works on friction, and over time that friction will wear off. It's almost like overusing sandpaper, where eventually that tension will go and it will need to be serviced. So I would recommend, if you do an LSD, you go with WaveTrack, because it actually works on like a wave design. Like they almost look like washers in their demos, but they're kind of waved and they lock into place. And then that's how they always move together, is that they're pressed together with kind of like this, wavy plate that holds it in together. But if there's too much tension, that wave formation can break. So I would say go with that, and that one is over $3,000. And I would even say that, if you don't plan to keep your car, that far into the future where you would need to service the diff, I would still say it's over $3,000. One, because if you don't plan on doing it yourself, you're going to have to pay for the labor. You're going to have to pay for at least 2 sets of fluids, because one, you do the rear diff, you're going to have to do the initial fluid, and then that fluid it's kind of like a rinse. So all of the metal shavings, all of the compounds or whatever that are still stuck on the metal, you're going to kind of rinse that away after, I think, like 1,000 miles or so. If you really wanted to be frugal about it, of course, you could, drain your old diff and then put into the new one, but then you're kind of contaminating the new system. It'd be better to keep it clean. And that diff fluid isn't cheap. So when you factor all that in, even if you are going to do it yourself and you're not going to do the labor, you're going to have to factor in the downtime. Maybe you have to take a day off of work, because this is not an easy 20-minute job. I would even argue that coilovers are easier, because for the most part, coilovers are simply bolt on, bolt off. You pull it a little bit out of the knuckle and then you drop the other one in. Here, you're going to have to use a pry bar in order to pop off the axles. And then the nut that's in front of that blue collar there, that's a 50 mil nut. That thing is tremendously tough to get off unless you have the BMW specialty tool, which looks like an open-ended 12 box end wrench. And I'm not sure the measurement on that. But this is going to be, whether you're paying someone to do it, you're going to be over $3,000, or if you take days off of work to do it, or even just, your own personal time, you have to factor that in. And I would say that is definitely over $3,000. Now, what about sway bars? Sway bars, the whole set, the one from Turner that I have is about $1,000. And at that price point, I would still recommend the control arms over these. To a certain extent, I almost regret installing these, not because they don't perform well, but because of the tremendous amount of effort involved to install them. For M cars, the fronts are very easy because it's below the subframe. While on the non-M cars, it's above the subframe. So you have to slightly drop both of them. And the one in the rear is even more of a pain because of all the panels that you have to remove just to get to it. And then you're locked up by like the 3 control arms that are in the area. So it's a pain to do the rear. The front is a little bit easier, but you have to be more careful because you have to disengage the link for the steering rack. So you have to be very, very careful when you're doing the front. And then also when you're doing the sway bars, you have to factor in, if you plan to do coilovers, will these coilovers, my end links and the sway bar be compatible? It's a pretty big headache for the amount of trade-off that you get versus just waiting and doing coilovers, because I feel that eventually you will need to do the arms at some point. It's a wear item. And then everybody, for the most part, who wants to lower their car will either go springs or coilovers. And for us, I'm recommending coilovers. The amount of body roll that's reduced by these sway bars, you get when you do coilovers for the most part. And because when you're dropping that ride height, just seeing how the 228i felt with the coilovers, with no arms, stock sway bar, it felt, I want to say 80-90% of how my car feels. Of course, the steering is a little bit softer because it didn't have the arms at the time. But yeah, I would say sway bars do last. It is a headache. If you can do all the other things and you're game for this one you do really have to set off a lot. I would say like this is, if you're doing both, this is going to take more time than the rear diff. If you have the pumpkin already, it's pre-installed in the pumpkin, this will take longer than the diff. And it's very tedious. The rear is extremely tedious. The fronts can be too, but the rear is even more tedious. You have to unplug all the sensors. You have to remove the wheel liner. You have to lower the subframe. You have to, drop the exhaust a little bit. It's not a fun job. And then, as I was mentioning, it's the rear arms that hold up that rear sway bar. And the reason why I didn't really recommend the rear arms is because once you've done all the other things, these have very minimal effect or noticeable effect on the car. Of course, if you're doing everything, you will want to touch on these too, and you do get the spherical bushings over the rubber ones. So there is a plus to that. However, if you do plan to do the rear arms, this is what I would recommend. Wait for them to go on sale. I believe that what is this? The rear, this is not the rear tow arm. This is the, oh no, this is the rear tow arm. And I think this one down here is the rear traction arm. And then these are the 2 upper arms over here on the side. The one over here down in the corner by itself, I would recommend do last. This is going to be the one that's the least noticeable. And because they're working in unison, they play off of each other. And it's also the most expensive. I think the price of these arms is equivalent to the price of these. And the reason why I would say that is because these two arms, the one on the top is responsible for locking the suspension in place in case you hit something like a speed bump or a dip, whatever. It keeps the components in line in case there's that kind of shock. So this will help you keep your tire wear even if you have inconsistent terrain, while the one on the bottom will pretty much set the suspension in place, at least for the rears. And if you've seen that eccentric bolt that they turn all the time just to dial it in, eventually that adjustment goes away because the rubber degrades, and so there's some give there. While this is all solid metal, it'll lock it into place, and you don't have to worry about getting alignments as often anymore if you have these two in. So this kind of places the alignment, and then this one is like the padlock to keep it closed. These ones do if you have the money, but even the shop says that they're not that minimum. They're not that noticeable or impactful for the price. You're already at $800. Just do the fronts versus these ones in the rears first. And then if you're addressing the rears, do these two on the left before you do the other two upper right ones. And last but not least is the strut bar, which I will admit is probably just as noticeable as those two rear arms that we touched on earlier. However, I will say this is the most fun project that I've done on the car because it's kind of like a transplant of M parts onto a non-M car. And then there's a little bit of cutting involved. So you're not 100% sure if it's going to fit, but once it does fit, you're extremely happy that it fits, and you get the satisfaction of doing it yourself. I would say unless you really like the looks of it, this is not something that I would say pay a shop to do. This is something I would say if you want to have a little bit of fun and you have the money to do it, money and time to do it, go ahead and do this. But the effects are very minimal, especially when you consider doing other things like coilovers and the arms. I think I bought most of these parts used, except for like the actual hardware, like the nuts and bolts. So like the strut bar, the carbon fiber strut bar, the aluminum bar at the top, all of those were used off of eBay. And I think all in, I was probably a little over $1,000 for that price point. Just do the arms. But like I said, if you want to have a little bit of fun, this is the way to go. You could always just get one that goes over the top if you really want a strut bar. The only thing is that it gets a little annoying every time you want to do something because you have to undo the strut bar in order to remove the intake. If you get the one that just goes over the two mounts, you're going to have to remove it every time you need to remove the engine cover. Here, there's a way that you could sneak out the engine cover without removing the carbon fiber brace, but it's kind of a headache every time you want to work in this area. But it's a fun project, and it's really rewarding once it's all in. So with that said, let's go ahead and jump into our Q&A section. We have Defect over here. Hey Fritz, hope you had a good weekend. I've actually got Dynon suspension, Dynon springs, and Dynon progressive bump stops, and absolutely love it on my M235i. All right. Well, Defect, if you want, if you have any pictures like on your Instagram, feel free to, let everybody know your handle, so that we could take a look as well. So here we go. So you know what? I should have remembered that Dynon is actually very good at making, because they're a California-based company. So like the things that they do, like tunes, exhaust, all those things, they have the CARB certification behind it, but they're very good at making, I would call them daily drivable mods. And they're very well thought out. So they're not as aggressive as a KW or a Bilstein or H&R if you want to look at their like sway bars. They're not as aggressive, but they do offer a good amount of performance. And if you're in California, you're always going to be compliant. Harvey, the only good thing I could recommend would be adjustable sway bar end links, but only worth buying if you're on coils, etc. Yep, absolutely. The end links are just essentially they're just a transfer of force from one strut to the other by using the sway bar. It's a really weird concept. So I would say if you think of like it's a weird analogy, but if you think of like a seesaw that has two rocks on it, that's the force, right? So the force is like, you know, the imperfections on the road, you're turning, all of the things. And the seesaw, the actual board that goes, you know, from rock to rock is the sway bar. If you were to push down on one of the rocks, that's the sway bar end link in a sense, in a very rudimentary way of saying it. And as you can imagine, because there's two counterbalancing forces, it doesn't take that much effort to push down on the one that's already up, because it has all that potential energy to go down. It wants to go down based off of gravity, and the other side will want to go up. So as you push down, you don't have to pull up on the other one. It will just naturally go up. So it's just a transfer of the force. So if you wanted to go with a different brand even, you could do that if it saves you money. I would just say, if you're in an area where they salt the roads, keep that in mind when you're making your purchase. Also, know that SPL, they do the end links for places like Turner. However, the metals are not equivalent. They are both aluminum, but the Turner ones are a softer aluminum. I think they're like 6061, while the SPL ones, the black ones, those are not space grade, aircraft grade aluminum. So it is stronger. So it tends to bend versus break, even if the end link binds at some point. Just to do some testing, I actually put my old bent SPL end links. I was just keeping them for like demonstration purposes. But when I did the 228i, the OEM end links didn't work. So just for testing, just to make sure that they would work, I actually put those end links on with those V1s, and it lines up. There's a little bit of give because they are bent, but I think that that's about the right length. Caleb, might need to save a little more for the alignment afterwards, about $200. Yep, that's a good point. Completely. So if you have the $500 saved from any of the things that we talked about, Caleb touched on it, and you have $200 that you need to put down for the alignment. So you have $300 left over. I will say that let the coilover settle before you actually do the alignment. I know some places will say do it right away. And like, if you're just doing the dampers, then yes, you don't need to wait because that's a free-flowing system. The thing that settles is the springs. So you can imagine any spring that's not under load will stay at its fixed length. However, a spring that is under load, after some time, will readjust its length to its new, it'll be more compact. So that's why you want the suspension to settle a little bit. It's because of the spring. So don't put it on and take it to the shop the next day. Even if you, say, for example, didn't want to drive it, I would say drive it around the block a few times and let it, if you really are opposed to driving it without doing the alignment, just drive it around the block and let it sit for like a week or two. Let the weight of the car, naturally change the length of the spring. and then drive it to the alignment shop. You'll be fine. But even then, I would still say, because of, like imperfections on the roadway, you're still going to have a little bit more compression on the spring. But that's just to say for somebody who absolutely is opposed to driving the car without getting an alignment. David, your channel made me buy a 335i. Right on, man. Well, I also hope that the channel helps you save a lot of money when it comes time to do the maintenance and upgrades on the car. Happy to have you here, and hopefully we encouraged you to make a good decision. Again, anybody here, if you're new, if you just got a car, if you did any of these mods, feel free to tag yourself on Instagram or TikTok, whatever it is, so that we can all take a look, get some inspiration, know what fits, what doesn't fit, what works together well. These are just recommendations based off of my experience, but it's only one experience. If we have a bigger collection, all the better for everybody. Hey Fritz, I know your channel's about BMWs, but what other cars would you own? That's a good question. Honestly, this is like a cop-out. Before, I for business purposes, I would want to own or have a pretty good hold on the 2 Series platform. So I have an M235i. I've started doing work on a 228i. That is not mine. I want the M2 CS, and I did want an M240i. However, that B58 engine is in the Supra, and I know that I could touch, a wider audience if I got the Supra. All things being equal, things like suspension components are going to be the same from the M235i to the M240i, but being able to do those engine modifications with a slightly different suspension setup on the Supra would allow me to have a wider audience base. That's obviously in a perfect world. I don't plan to do any of that anytime soon. But that's kind of what I was thinking. Back then, I used to think that something like a Subaru would be good for my dad because he's older. The all-wheel drive function is good because, he's older. So, something all-wheel drive, pretty reliable, easy to maneuver. If he gets into trouble, it's a safe car. So it should be reliable for him. I was also thinking about the Civic Type R. I'm just not a fan of front wheel drive. I know a lot of people have said that it feels like rear wheel drive. I guess I would have to test it out. Like a Civic Type R wouldn't be bad for like commuting purposes. And I mean, it's a wide audience base, but honestly, if I were to get something like a Civic Type R, I wouldn't film anything like that for YouTube. I'd pretty much stick to BMWs, and like filming and all of those things do take some of the fun out of work on your car. So I guess like the Civic could be the fun car in a sense. I used to like some American cars, but they're trending more towards electric. So that's kind of steering me away for future potential cars. Yeah, maybe Porsche. A manual 7-speed Porsche would be nice. It'd be fun. I think they're like the only one who makes a 7-speed manual transmission. So to answer your question, if it's not for me, like my dad, I'd want him in something safe. If he really ends up not liking the F30 for whatever reason, maybe a Subaru for him. For me, daily driving, Civic Type R, or just for fun, Porsche with a 7-speed manual transmission. Car Snob. Might get a fun drift beamer one day. The E36 is pretty much unanimous as far as a fun little inexpensive drift car. And the platform is so old now that, there are a million manufacturers out there, especially when you want to do something like a drift car. Like the kits that they have for that, the amount of manufacturers for that is endless now. So there's a huge support system out there for the E36, and I would recommend that. It's cheap, it'll be fun. you know, you could, if something breaks that you don't want to buy new, then you could go to the junkyard. So like parts are very available for that car. Oh, Carsnob, thank you. Caleb, recommend SPL2. I have a few suspension bits from them. Yep, I do really like them. Their customer service is very, very good. And they do go on sale, you know, infrequently, but enough, I would say. If you're somebody who's saving up for these parts in increments, as we were talking about, I would say you can anticipate one sale for the part that you want throughout the year. And then you also have their Black Friday, Cyber Monday deal that you can count on. So if you're saving up, you know, you could grab 1 to 2 SPL bits a year, and that's good. Defect. I know your car is manual, but any opinions on the XHP transmission flash for the ZF8? Heard really good things, and apparently it shifts even faster, similar to a DCT. Who did this one? Look up Simply Car Things and maybe Nor. I think they had manual cars that they did this on, and I think they would second your sentiment here, that it does shift faster, it feels quicker, smoother, all the things by doing the flash. I just can't speak to it because I don't know, but hopefully that points you in the right direction. So you could look up something like Simply Car Things, manual transmission flash, Nor, BMW transmission flash, and see what comes up. Aaron, my M235i xDrive is driven on the road rarely. It's mostly used for track and autocross 5 to 6 times a year. I would like to help the car with body roll. Coilovers, honestly, is, if you're driven on like pristine roads, I guess you could kind of forego the control arms for now and just go big with coilovers. If you're at a point where like you want to throw something on right now and you have about $1,000, sway bars is the way to go. It's just a pain. It's just a pain. Even shops don't really like doing it because when you're at home and on jack stands, you're not going to lower the entire subframe. So you're going to kind of sneak it in. Shops, for the most part, because they have to worry about things like liability, they're going to lower the entire subframe. So they're going to disconnect the axles, brake lines, all of that, so that they can actually get on the mount for the bushings and torque them to spec. You really have to find funny ways to torque the bushings when you do the sway bars. But if you're doing it at a shop, they're going to drop that entire rear subframe and possibly even the front. I could see them, you do have more working space with the front though, so potentially they might only droop the front. More than likely for the rear, they're going to drop the whole thing. Aaron, price really isn't an issue from the things you just described, but I also don't want to buy more than what a casual tracker would need. If you're tracking the car, Club Sports. If you want a warranty, V3s, and get the camber plates from Vorschlag or Milway. I've heard that things like there is another camber plate manufacturer. I'm forgetting the name off the top of my head right now. However, they're great because they're very serviceable. All the parts are replaceable, but it's just a lot of moving parts in one area. So it leaves it open to more points of failure. If you get the V3s so that you have the warranty, the lifetime warranty, Club Sports, I don't believe have the lifetime warranty. I actually run the Vorschlag camber plates so I can speak to them. They've held up fine. Yes, they clunk a little bit, but that's normal. It's more or less one solid unit. And of course you have the sliding elements and the spherical bushing that is separated. But it has less points of failure, and that thing is pretty solid. And I don't want to say this. I'm not sure. Did you say what car you have? Oh, M235i. Actually, if you plan to fit like a strut bar on it, the good thing is that I think they only have one camber plate design, because the physical shape of it will fit in both an M car and a non-M car. A 228i, a 230i, 20, 30, 35, 40. It'll fit in all of those physically. It's just the screws that are different. And I believe that they actually pilot the holes all the same, because if you have a 3 bolt, 3 out of the 5 in the 5 bolt will fit. So at least with the Vorschlag, it will always fit. Versus if you go with the other one, oh my goodness, I'm really forgetting their name right now. But because it's all of those things are separated, it's not always going to be backwards compatible. If you want to do upgrades later on, you're going to have to buy the different components for it. I think Milway is good if it's for a street car though. Supposedly that's what people have said. I might try it with the F30 soon. Mr. Latin King. Hey, Fritz and chat. Wanted to ask before I go to a mechanic in a few days, but my 2007 328i clunks when going up inclined driveways and small bumps on the road. Thoughts? If it happens during braking and it's kind of repetitive, it could be the thrust arms. If you did suspension components and you have spherical bushings all over the place, that's completely normal. That just happens. If uphill, it could be your top hats too. End links could be it. Anything in that suspension chain, it could be it. The arms, it's easy to tell. You just do that test from 3 and 6 and 3 and 9, 12 and 6. If you have any wiggle there, it's probably one of the bushings from the arms. And then you could also just take a look at the arms too if you have it up that high already. You could also check on the end links condition. Most of those things, if you've never replaced them before, they're grease filled. They're either like kind of hollowed out rubber bushings, or they're like a sealed grease filled bushing. And if you see a bunch of grease, like a bunch of like grit in an area, that means one of the bushings have exploded. So I would say start with that. See if anything happens there. If everything looks good, it could be potentially like your shocks are shot, or it's the top hat. Maybe you could also check to see if the top hat, maybe the nut got loose potentially. Give all those things a shot first. I would say just check that all the nuts and bolts are tightened as they should be. Check to see if there's any grease around any of the bushings, and then go from there. Jordy, just a question out of context. Can I put a front bumper of an M2 or M4 on my M235i xDrive? From the M2, yes. The M4, no, because the headlight design is different. The 2 Series has a pointed inner headlight, while the 3 and the 4 Series have a more boxed off end. So the M2 you can, just not the M4. David, what would you recommend first? Maintenance on my maintenance on my 335 IS. It has 81,000 miles. If you haven't done it yet, coolant is probably what you're going to be looking at in that range. So I would say if you're going to do your coolant, you're also going to want to do that Mickey Mouse flange. That plastic one tends to break. You're going to want to do a metal one. If you're already going to drain the coolant, I would say check your oil filter housing gasket. And if that thing is already starting to sweat, go ahead and do your oil filter housing gasket along with the coolant flush so that you don't have to, do the coolant drain or lose fresh coolant again. Yeah, so so if you're going to do the coolant, this is what I would recommend. Do the coolant and then do the oil filter housing gasket. Once you've done the coolant, check on your belt and your belt tensioner. From there, if the car is running fine, you're good to go. But expect with that amount of mileage, if you haven't done it yet, potentially down the road, your coils and spark plugs to be replaced. However, what you could do is, and it's not that major of a thing, usually when they go, it's like, you'll know, you could just buy a set of spark plugs and coils and just put it off to the side somewhere. When your car starts to kind of like misfire or whatever, or sounds weird, replace it. That's what you could do. And at 80,000 miles, that's what you can expect. Other than the typical, like oil change, rotate your tires, stuff like that. That's what you can expect around that 80,000 mile mark. Eduardo, hello Fritz. Is there any other LSD you know of that you would recommend? Do you have preferences regarding camber plates? Thanks. If you don't plan to keep your car for a while, you could go with the cheapest option. That's the M Performance Diff. It's direct fit and finish. You know that it'll fit. And it's probably like the cheapest option out there. So I would recommend, if you're going to go with a friction-based LSD, don't spend the extra money on Quaife. Unless, of course, it's on sale or you find it cheaper. But it's more or less the same, or at least it functions the same way as the M Performance Diff. I just recommend that if you plan to keep your car for a while and you don't want to have to service it later on down the way, go with the WaveTrack. Camber plates, I can honestly recommend the Vorschlags. They've held up fine in the almost 2 years that I've had them. I plan to run Milway plates on the F30 when I do the V3s on them. I normally wouldn't have done the V3s on my dad's F30. It's just, a situation came up where I was able to come up on them. And some of you won't believe this. This is one of those like once in a blue moon, hard to repeat. Like I honestly couldn't fathom, like other than a very fortunate scenario where this would happen. But the V3s are about like $2,800 plus tax and shipping. I was able to pick up a set of V3s, or I'm going to be picking up a set of V3s for about $2,000. So at that price point, you're going to get V1s or you're going to get V3s. Let's see what else we got over here. John Santos. My oil pan on M235i started leaking. I've been checking it every day, and it's between the HL high-low for about 3 weeks now. Should I be concerned or should I just write it out? Don't want to spend $2,000. Let's take a look at something. So if you're going to have to redo that, and I've actually been thinking about this. Sorry, let's see. So let's go to second display. Oh, how come it's not showing? There we go. So the oil pan for like a full-blown oil pan, I guess with everything, nuts, bolts, gasket, the whole thing is about $3,000. So close to what you're saying. Oh no, this is the S55 and pump. Why is it saying S55? S55, but then it's not for the M cars. You know what? This might be the retrofit kit. So that's exactly what I was saying. If you're going to spend close to 2K and you don't, then you could just get the gasket. However, the only thing is that you're just going to have to make sure that you clean off that stuff really well. You're going to have to slightly lower the subframe at the very least, if not completely drop it. And then, you know, swap over the gasket into your new one. So you're going to have to scrape it off really good. And I think, let's see, M235i. Let's see here. And supposedly you're supposed to switch out all the hardware. So you're looking at about $200. I'm not sure how much a shop is going to charge for the labor. I could roughly estimate maybe 3 to 4 hours of shop time. So maybe factor in another $400-500. So you're about at $1,000 if you're doing just the gasket. And so oh, this isn't even the right one. Good old Google. But I think, yeah, just the gasket alone is like a couple $100. F65 oil pump. This is the retrofit kit. So yeah, maybe about $1,000, half of what you're thinking. You're going to save a lot of money if you do it yourself. Just lay down a lot of towels, a lot of rags, save a bunch of cardboard beforehand. But I would say replace it as soon as you get a chance. The leak is only going to get worse. I would say clean off the area, see how fast the leak is. If you can ride it out until the time where you can take off from work, or you can save it for like a long weekend, you could probably bang it out in that amount of time. Just have a lot of just have like maybe 1 to 2 extra jacks, depending on if you're using bottle jacks or floor jacks. And if you extra jack stands, be ready to go. This is going to be very similar intensive work. In order to get space to clean and remove that oil pan and then lay down the new one is very similar to the sway bar installation as far as like lowering the subframe. But if you were forced to spend that amount of money, I would say go with the S55 one. I think it's made out of aluminum versus like a cast steel. I forget what it is, but I think it's lighter, and it has the pump to prevent, like if you do track your car, and on the N55 it's very rare, but under higher G's, when you're say like cornering, drifting, whatever it is, there's a chance that the system could run dry if the oil sways all to one side. With the S55 and its pump, it prevents that from happening. It will always have oil in the system, no matter supposedly how hard you swing the car. Mr. Latin King, never replace. Just got the car a few months ago for work. I'll look for play on the wheel and grease around the shocks. It clunks when I'm turning the wheel onto an incline and down inclines. When you're turning, sounds like end links to me. Just going off of that. I would say it's either end links or your control arms, because when you're on incline or decline, it's more compressed, so you're putting more pressure on that bushing. But because you're saying it specifically when you're turning, I would say like if you're on the incline and you don't hear anything, and then you turn and you hear something, I'm leaning more towards end links. If you go up or down the driveway and you hear something and then you turn it and you hear something again, then I would say probably control arms. One of the control arms. Has 128,000 miles. Yeah, well, overall, that suspension, if it's never been replaced, it's due. All the components are due. Opinion on the B58 coils for the N55. I haven't seen this modification. However, unless you're buying the high performance ignition coils that will trigger, like a better spark for the system, because everything is computerized, upgrading your coils without the proper coating, without the appropriate fuel injectors and the gap on the plugs, it's not going to do much. I've had people who've brought their car into the shop that I go to at SUVMR, and I've asked them about coils, and they say it's very minimal, unless you have to do all three of those things in order for you to really notice anything. You have to do your injectors, your coils, and properly gap the plugs with a proper tune in order for it all to work well. If you're doing just the coils, a lot of people say that they regret it because they don't notice it, or they're like, yeah, it was on sale and I plan to do all of the things, but it was on sale, so I picked it up, but as of right now, it doesn't do anything on its own. That's the sentiment that I've been getting. KMZ Nexus, for example, I'm not sure what that is. Maybe someone can help me out, or you could elaborate a little bit. Eduardo, do you have any thoughts on the rear subframe bushing? Are solids or poly beneficial and safe for the chassis? If you're going to track your car, you can go solid. The only thing with solid is that over time, you could develop cracks on the actual chassis because that's solid aluminum running up right against it. I would say poly is the best way to go if you plan to keep your car long term and if you're going to street it. Honestly, if you're not tracking your car, you won't really notice the difference between poly and solid. If you track your car, of course you'll notice a difference. NVH for the subframe bushings is very minimal between the two. You'll notice more NVH if you do the rear diff bushing. So I would say if you're going to do the subframe bushings, save it for when you do the rear diff, or if you do the sway bars. Now that I think about it, I should have done it then. The other thing too is poly is going to be much easier to install versus solid metal. Metal is a pain to install. If you thought pressing out that old rubber bushing was a pain, pressing in metal bushings is a tiresome task. If you don't have a press, and if you're going to do it with the subframe still on the car and you're at a lower, so a less than optimal position to press it in. So I would recommend poly just for the ease of installation if you plan to do it yourself. Obviously, if you take it to a shop, you go metal. Just be aware that metal could cause cracks on the actual body of the car because it's right up on it. There's nothing to soften that blow. So I was even thinking about doing metal on the subframe bushings, but I'm probably never going to track the car, so I'll probably do poly to get the additional benefit without the drawback of the metal causing that stress on the car. Freddie Lamb, what suspension do you recommend that won't lower your car but improves your overall ride on an M240i? I don't know any suspension that you could do that won't lower the ride height. If I'm not, yeah, I'll lower it slightly. If I'm not mistaken, like there are some adjustable springs that won't lower the height of the car, but then to me, that's kind of wasting your money. With coilovers, you're just going to have to kind of accept some amount of drop. If I'm not mistaken, Bilsteins drop a little bit less than the KWs. It's kind of like a dual benefit, or like a it kind of helps the perceived improvement of coilovers by dropping the height. Because if you think of like handling a car, it's easier to handle a car versus it is to handle a lifted truck. It's because the car is lower to the ground, the center of gravity is closer to the ground, so you don't have to worry about it tipping. When you do coilovers, yes, you get the better dampening, you get the better springs, they're paired together, but it's also because the car is lower that all of those things are even more enhanced. So that's why I think all of them do lower to a certain degree. However, unless somebody else knows, feel free to drop that in the chat. KMZ, so if you could elaborate a little bit more on the Nexus. And in the meantime, if anybody else has any other questions, feel free to let me know. Or if there's a topic that you'd like me to touch on for next week, feel free to drop that in and we can address it next week and we can give it its own segment as well. Let's see here. Yeah, but let's see. As those are coming in, let's see if we can find the actual. Okay, FCP Euro, you should be good for this, right? Let's go with 2015 BMW. Let's see, what car was that again? M235i. So I guess it's a little bit different if you have an X-Drive car. And the transmission will vary too. So M235i. We'll look up both. Oh my goodness. Okay. What? Okay. BMW F22. Yeah. Beamer World. Oh, the gasket is only $45. Okay. I would still recommend grabbing all the hardware when you do this. It's supposed to be single use. And while you have it out, you might as well. Let's see here. Fitment. No, that is not it. Lies. Okay, $55. So, but I would say you probably want to grab the rest of the kit too. Grab a couple of scrape tools and some of those Scotch-Brite brushes. in order to make sure that you get all of the old gasket off without scratching the receiving side of the gasket. So Eduardo, do you think Bilstein B16s and stock sway bars don't need adjustable end links? Are front and rear adjustable arms necessary for a very good handling car? B16s with stock sway bars should work with the stock end links. However, just be careful when you order it, because certain cars, like certain F30s and certain F22s, like the base models, they use the same end link from left to right. They don't have a unique shape to each side. However, other models like the 35s and the 40s, they do have their own unique shape. So make sure that when you're selecting the Bilsteins, that you'll probably want to submit your VIN in order to make sure that you get the correct strut. Otherwise, you're going to have to look for at least one new end link to pair with it. And then, are front and rear adjustable arms necessary for a very good handling car? Rears, I don't think so. I would say that the two arms that I recommended earlier are really there to prolong your alignment and lock it into place. The two upper arms, from what everybody's told me, it's very minimal for the amount of money that you're putting in. So the two front arms, yes, because as I said before, they will help with the bump steer. They will help fine tune any rubbing if you plan to fit in wider wheels. And those do go bad eventually. The tie rod, so if you do them actually relatively soon, because in the front you have your tie rod, your lower control arm, and your thrust arm, all working on that axis of the hub. Sorry, on the knuckle. Because they're all working together, if you do the first two relatively early on, you probably won't need to replace your tie rod like until the very distant future, because one, it has very minimal impact on that system. Like already out of those three arms, it's not working as hard as the other ones are in a standstill. Like when you're turning, obviously, yes. However, when you do the other ones, and those are so much beefier, those are taking more of the hit, if you will. And so the tie rod can last longer. In the rear, eventually, if you plan to keep your car for a long time, the two other arms will kind of pay for themselves. So say, for example, you do an alignment every 6 months. Maybe you could do an alignment every year afterwards. So because you don't have to get an alignment as frequently, and because of that, your alignment is going to be locked into place, so you will have better tire wear overall. In a roundabout way, it will save you money, but I would say just wait for them to go on sale. It's not something that I would say you have to have it. It's like, oh, hey, it's on sale right now, and I do have the money. That's how I would view those ones in the rear. And with that, I think we've addressed everything for today. If anything else comes up, feel free, everybody, reach out to me on Instagram or TikTok at VroomTuber. I hope all of you are doing safe, doing well. Stay warm and dry out there. And I'll see all of you next week.